All right, good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you're able to join us today during this webinar. My name is Allison Goebel, and I am the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Lindsay Elam, who's GOPC's Manager of Research, as well as the city managers from a variety of cities around the state. Joshua Smith from the City of Hamilton, Tanisha Briley from the City of Cleveland Heights, and Eric Wobser from the City of Sandusky. We are hosting today's webinar, Planning for Recovery 101, in partnership with the Ohio State Resource Network, which I will briefly explain here in a moment. First, however, I do want to acknowledge that we are living through a moment where things are happening rapidly and the future feels unknown. We developed this webinar several weeks ago with the intention of giving local governments guidance on how to recover from the COVID crisis. As the recent racial justice protests made clear, our communities have a lot of work ahead of them on multiple fronts, specifically racial justice and police and community relations, along with the expected contractions of resources due to COVID. While we cannot tackle all of these challenges today, I will say that my casual observation is that those places that have trust between residents and the local government seem to be having productive conversations that are already advancing a range of goals. There's a lot that goes into building trust, but one thing that we know is that transparent governments that can rationally explain policy decisions earn residents' confidence and tend to fare better versus those that residents perceive as not having a game plan. So we do hope that today's webinar gives you the tools to begin charting game plans for your own community's futures. Before I explain what the State Resource Network is, I do want to cover some housekeeping. So we are recording right now. We will be sending out slides and a recording of the webinar afterwards and making the webinar available as an archived webinar. My colleague Lindsay Elam is our IT guru today. She will keep you on mute until the question and answer periods and discussion period. We are going to have each of the city managers talk about what they're seeing in their communities, how existing plans are guiding them through events today. After each city manager, we will open up a short question and answer period, just 2 to 3 minutes if you have a burning question for either Joshua, Tanisha, or Eric. We will also be monitoring the chat box, and then we are reserving the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's 1-hour webinar for discussion. So the first, so the State Resource Network, as many of you know, Ohio has a number of communities that has struggled to regain population and economic activity from historic highs. And we expect that these challenges will be exacerbated by COVID-19. So Ohio felt ripe for a program that could provide communities with tools to address the root causes of their distress before communities become subject to fiscal oversight from the state. That is where the Ohio State Resource Network comes in. The Ohio State Resource Network is part of the National Resource Network, which is made up of experts of varying capabilities to serve communities. It is generously funded by Arnold Ventures and the Just Transition Fund. Through the network, multi-year financial planning and community and economic development consultants have been working with Sandusky and Greenfield, Ohio, to provide comprehensive, tailored approaches to strengthen their areas. We will soon be accepting applications from communities located with the Appalachian Regional Commission, the Ohio footprint for the Appalachian Regional Commission. So if you are interested and are within that footprint, please reach out. We do want to know. We do want to know your interest and can tell you more about the network itself. So given the expected impacts of COVID, the Ohio State Resource Network decided to create this pandemic-focused webinar series to broaden its reach and serve even more communities throughout the state. GOPC is one of the 3 partners supporting the network. So today is the second webinar of our COVID-19 focus series. We are facilitating a panel presentation on creating and affirming community visions, as well as introducing planning strategies that have worked in panelist cities that you can consider implementing. From our perspective at the Greater Ohio Policy Center, as communities reposition through and after COVID-19 and recommit themselves to equitable recovery, the principles of legacy city recovery to us we think are going to remain in place and continue to be important. And this Some of those principles are: one, having a vision for the future that is realistic about where we stand currently, a clear sense of where your community fits as in a niche, where you sit within the global, national, or regional economy. Making sure that there's an all hands on deck approach where everyone, all community members, all civic organizations, local government, philanthropy, business, etc., are working together and working within their own lanes. What we see in other communities is that where there is sufficient civic capacity, meaning the ability to respond quickly and nimbly to challenges and the ability to seize opportunity, those are the places that we see faring well after the housing crisis 10 years ago and even in events before that. What we've known too is that cities that have big goals but advance on those in an incremental way, continuing to move with progress, builds the momentum to then take on larger challenges and achieve larger wins. This strategic incrementalism is a concept Alan Malik, who many of you probably know, writes a lot about, and we agree that this continues to be an important strategy. And then last, undergirding it all, a recognition that equity, racial, economic, social justice, etc., that equity creates a stronger, more sustainable, vibrant community. And that without an ongoing commitment to equity, the communities shortchange themselves of the opportunities and successes that they can achieve. I'm going to start here and hand this off to Joshua Smith, who, as I said earlier, is the city manager for the city of Hamilton. Many of the concepts that I just breezed through right now are disclaimed in greater detail in the supplemental materials that accompany this the email that you got for this webinar, and then will also be on our website. But for now, let's talk straight with the experts. I'm going to hand this off to Joshua. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison. It's been a long time since anyone's ever called me an expert of anything, so thank you for that also. I just want to quickly run through some of the things that we have done in Hamilton, Ohio, and what we focused on in the last 90 days in particular. The first thing that we did when COVID was becoming a reality in mid-March was we went to City Council and had them authorize a $300,000 gift card stimulus program. In the first week or two around St. Patrick's Day, when things were still very unknown across the state of what was happening actually in the world in terms of closures, how long they would last, we wanted a lot of our smaller businesses to have some surety, or even call it a small safety net, that the city understood what they were going through and wanted to keep them viable. So Council, to their credit, on almost no discussion, passed a $300,000 gift card stimulus program to keep it from being too overly political. We passed it to the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, who quickly assembled a team of people ranging from the Hamilton Community Foundation, some other business leaders, to look at a one-page application that we put together very quickly. The short of it is we were able to get $300,000 into the local community through gift cards before March was even out, that gave some of our newer small restaurants, our retail shops, et cetera, the ability to cover bills for the next few months. I think the largest recipient was $30,000 for one of our newer restaurants. A lot of our smaller retail shops received anywhere between $5,000 and $15,000. And what we promised the small businesses is that the gift cards would not be redeemed until June. So even though they got the money, a check in their hand before April 1st, they had a 60-day grace period, if you will, before any of the gift cards could even be redeemed. And that allowed them to keep that money in their hands as quickly as possible. The more detailed thing that we did, the more purposeful, if you will, was we created what we called a rapid restart team. That was created the first week of April with the sole mission really being, how do we provide assistance that's requested from small businesses while proactively, even without the requested assistance, do things that we felt would benefit the small businesses and attract consumers back in. So this is getting ready while things were still shut down in April and heading into May, getting ready for a reopening, and still, since it was somewhat nebulous on what a reopening even meant, just trying things, but giving this rapid restart team, which was comprised of several people from the city team, the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, and some small businesses that wish to participate, the flexibility to be very nimble and to what I call lead blocking through the bureaucracy. So if they wanted to move 10 tables from point A to point B, that they had the permission to do that without having to go through the normal channels. They wanted to paint an alley and make it look nice for outdoor dining. They had the ability to do that. And I went and sat down with my director of economic development, and we quickly reallocated $125,000 from multiple line items into his budget into a single line item that I gave full permission to the Rapid Restart team to draw on at any point they wanted to. So if they needed to buy tables, chairs, paint, whatever that would be, they had that ability to do that. And that's really worked out very well for us. Our outside dining is never been as robust as it is today. And that is probably a good segue into my third point, which is, while all this uncertainty was going on, we remained laser focused on two things: our existing and impending economic development pipeline, but also the plans that we had put into place in the last few years, our Parks Plan, our Plan Hamilton, which is our overarching comprehensive plan. And I think, to paraphrase Warren Buffett, when people are running out is when you should be running in. So we effectively doubled down on several things, some of our trail enhancements, putting budget dollars into just a variety of things that had been spelled out in our Plan Hamilton, and just being very creative. We've created a number of 10-minute parking spots throughout the downtown to cater to businesses that were at the time relying on takeout. But even today, there's I think our takeout and outdoor dining is still incredibly robust. And they've asked us to make that permanent, which council's in the process of codifying right now, that we'll have, we went from 0 10-minute parking spots downtown to where we'll have 20 when this is all said and done. And finally, our strategic planning process. I think cities that are on this webinar today are perfectly situated to be the city of the future. I don't want to say anything negative about a New York City or Los Angeles, cities that I absolutely love and adore, but when there's going to be more working from home, people want some outdoor space that has some separation from other people. I think that we're in the process of reworking our strategic plan, which we do on an annual basis anyway. But I'm very excited about where we're at as a city. And because Hamilton took so many lumps, 2008 to 2010, I think that I know our impact due to COVID has been incredibly minimal compared to many of the larger city managers that I've been speaking with. And I'm honestly very excited about where Hamilton is right now, but where Hamilton is going to be going into the very near future. Thank you.
Joshua, that's great. We have 2 questions in the chat box related to the gift cards, and so I'll ask those. And then I'd like you maybe to just talk a little bit more about the Plan Hamilton, and just maybe some of the key tenets in it, maybe a little bit of the history of how that came about. But first, we'll get to the gift card questions. So the first one is, Jessica Gribbins from Richland County wants to know, where did the funds for the gift card program come from? And then Dominic Matthew from Northeast Ohio wants to know if the gift cards are restricted to certain uses or how businesses can use them.
So the first question, the funds were general funds. We created a budget stabilization fund about 5 years ago when we had a budget surplus. We would put money into the budget stabilization fund. There's a council policy that was established that once we hit 10% of our unrestricted reserves relative to our annual operating spending. So if our operating spending is $50 million a year, once we had $5 million held in reserve, we funnel money into a budget stabilization fund and a capital project fund. So there's a formula that's built into a resolution. So we've built about a little over $3 million into this budget stabilization fund. And I just told City Council, I said in my staff report to them, you can take this out. You know, the money is not going to come back in because legally we could not make the loans to the city. We had to gift the money to a 501c3, which would, in this case was HEDC, which is an arm of the Hamilton Area Chamber of Commerce. So I said, the money's not coming back. I said, that being said, this is an investment to keep our bricks and mortar alive during this time, because I said, short term, yes, it's $300,000 out of our pockets. Long term, I said, it's going to be one of the best investments you can make. And to their credit, again, it was a 7-0 vote. They agreed wholeheartedly with that philosophy. The second question was the restrictions, I think, to what businesses. I'm not exactly sure. We did have Frost Brown Todd, our legal counsel, do a quick review, and they're the ones that said that we had to provide it to the 501c3 nonprofit. But we left it up to the committee to where it went. But we generally put the parameters that we wanted it to go to restaurants, retail, things of that nature. And we just went through our audit and we weren't cited for anything. So I take that as a good sign that the auditor was not too upset with that.
That's great, Joshua. Were those limited to just the businesses in your downtown along your main street, or were they citywide?
They were citywide, and I'm just looking at something off screen here, but it really was focused towards the small business and the non-chain. So like Applebee's was not something that we were going to give to, but if you were a small restaurant in Hamilton, that would be considered. So if you were part of a national chain, you were generally excluded. But we gave it to everything from tire shops to hair salons. Now the restaurants and a lot of the retail shops in the downtown certainly were a primary focus, but if you look at our entire footprint, we did put money throughout the entire community.
And then 2 minutes on Plan Hamilton.
Yes. So the priorities of Plan Hamilton, and that's why I'm looking off screen here for a second, grow businesses and jobs, improve our local connections. We want to do a better job of connecting Hamilton to the region, enhance the well-being of our residents and neighborhoods, and encourage development and redevelopment. And really, it was a lack of our comprehensive plan. You know, coming out of a city manager, me being a city manager in other cities, the comprehensive plan was really the cornerstone of our planning commission and city council when it came to certain policy decisions. And I felt since I had been in Hamilton, that had been lacking. I mean, I give Liz Hayden and our planning department tremendous credit, and many of our staff who worked tirelessly on the creation of this. But we really focused on getting residents into the building and out into the different neighborhoods that we had meetings in to get their input. It was very important that from a comprehensive planning perspective, that we built something that truly was representative of what our residents in our 17 neighborhoods desired.
Great, thank you, Joshua. And this will not be the last time we ask you questions, but we'll move on right now and invite Tanisha to come. Let me move the slide here. But Tanisha, it'd be great to hear from you a little bit of the history of Cleveland Heights and the plans that have been guiding both the immediate responses that you have been deploying in response to COVID, but also kind of longer term redevelopment and revitalization.
Great, thank you, Allison, and thanks for having me today. I really appreciate being on with this group and this amazing group of cities that are participating. So Cleveland Heights was fortunate to be one of 50 cities that were assisted by the National Resource Network several years ago. We were the only city in Ohio to receive this assistance, which is similar to what we are, what you all are offering through the new Ohio network. We actually had 3 projects that fell mostly into the economic development and community development bucket. And the technical assistance that we received from partners like PFM, Enterprise Community Partners, HRNA, and even NYU. We had a group of graduate students helping us from NYU. it was invaluable. The work we did with NRN served as a foundation for and also dovetailed with our city's first ever comprehensive master planning effort. Our master plan covers 10 vision areas, and I'm not going to talk about them all, but in a few minutes I'll tell you about one of the areas we're focusing on, which we believe will certainly help us in our response and recovery efforts. But a little about Cleveland Heights. We're an inner-ring, densely populated suburb of Cleveland with about 45,000 residents. We have been hard hit by significant population decline, housing value and housing stock decline, and increased poverty. The housing crisis for us actually started in the early 2000s and was exacerbated by the Great Recession. And so we know that recessions have a cumulative effect. And in places like ours, we tend to be harder hit and we no longer really fully recover. So each new downturn, like the one we're facing now as a result of COVID-19, leaves a permanent setback. So all of our strategies are geared around trying to combat that and at least get us back to even. So we know for people, earnings and savings become eroded in these situations, which creates hardships for them that impact their daily lives, their ability to build wealth, their ability to reinvest in their property, which translates immediately into the city's resources, the community as a whole, and what we have available to help provide service. Like most Ohio cities, 3/4 of our revenue actually comes from income tax and property tax, with income tax being the lion's share. And this vulnerability makes us highly susceptible to downturns like this. So population loss, employment and wage declines, and property values hurt us the most. But the good news is that our previous planning processes, starting with the National Resource Network engagement that led into our master plan, those strategies outline were designed to address these vulnerabilities. And as Joshua said, I agree, now is the time to double down on those strategies. So I'll just talk about one of ours, which is related to building our population, which is one of the ways that we can insulate ourselves and be more sustainable in the future. And we're doing that in a number of ways. The one I want to talk about is housing, which is a huge challenge for us. We're a historic community. The vast majority of our homes were built before 1920. And that creates difficulty in the best of circumstances, but certainly when residents and property owners are facing economic challenges through job loss or wage erosion, those kinds of things. So we needed to, one of the things we learned through the network process is we didn't have the civic capacity. Obviously the city can't do any of this alone. And we don't, unlike Hamilton, we don't have a chamber. We didn't really have organizations, a nonprofit network that we could really sort of deputize and enhance our capacity to do things that we know will make a real difference for our community today and into the future. So we needed to build some civic capacity. And we actually ended up working with several nonprofit organizations, and this is probably not the right word to use, but kind of co-opted their mission a bit so that we can make them strategic partners in carrying out some of the key strategies in our planning. So for example, we don't have a community development corporation, and we knew that our capacity to restore vacant property, which we have way too much of, vacant and decrepit homes that have been abandoned through the housing crisis that, again, it's over 20 years now in this city. And how do we return those homes back to productive use, get some homeowners, which also helps to build our population. We couldn't do that alone at all. And so we needed to work with partners. None of our existing nonprofit network had that capacity, but we certainly had a lot of community members, as individuals and organizations that were very passionate and very interested in helping the city in that way. So we worked with enterprise community partners early on through our network engagement to help build the capacity of one of the organizations that then became a CDC. And we've been able to funnel several homes to them in the last 2 years. I could pull up at some point, if we have time, some before and after pictures. They are really making a difference in making the home attractive again, that street, which has a neighborhood impact, which increases our ability to attract our fair share and hopefully even more of the tiny bit of growth that we get here in Northeast Ohio. So working with this organization, Future Heights, helping them to build their capacity to start to do this work. We then started doing that with 2 other nonprofits in the community, so that we now have 3 partners engaged in this work. And we have probably tripled our capacity in what we would normally do in a year, as far as reinvestment and renovation of homes. They're now going to start to move toward an infill strategy. And these things we know going back to pre-COVID, just looking at coming out of the recession and how do we rebuild ourselves and prepare for the next downturn and become more resilient. I would tell anyone listening that, it almost feels like a knee-jerk reaction, a natural reaction, to take a look at plans that look pretty aspirational in light of COVID, and feel that you can't move those things forward, or you need to rework them, or they're just not viable anymore. And I would tell you that if they were sound, solid planning efforts, those strategies that applied in 2008, or after or before that, they're still viable strategies for your community. The beast we're fighting looks a bit different, but the vulnerabilities and risks that each community has are the same, and those strategies are already designed to combat those. So you need to figure out where you double down. We can't retreat from everything and expect to be positioned for recovery. And I know there's some specific community dynamics that everyone needs to examine for their own community, but housing continues to move. Homes are still selling in our community. And so we want to make sure that we're providing those options, that we're continuing to fund those organizations, helping them to maximize their capacity and hours, so that strategy can continue on. So there's lots of others I can talk about, but I'll leave it at that and kind of see where Q&A takes us.
Tanisha, that's great. Thank you. We don't have any questions in the chat box. I'll give folks a minute if they want to add anything. I guess one question I have for you is, Joshua talked about kind of reshuffling a little bit of the city's budget and moving funds out of one line item to another. Have you had to do that or contemplated doing that in order to keep some of these priorities moving forward, even as expected revenues decline?
Yeah, we have. We've done a fair bit of that. I would say, again, I'm going to take Joshua's term, this doubling down does require some shifting of priorities, and you're not going to be able to do everything at once. So the most promising strategies do deserve more funding, which means in most cases, right, since we don't have printing presses, we have to shift dollars. So one of our huge projects, we have a very large and declining outdoor mall where actually City Hall is housed, so I get to look at this thing every day. One of our projects through the network was a really well done, multi-phased plan of trying to influence what happens with this property. We don't own it. It's owned by investors whose business model is to make money off the loss associated with owning the property. So it's an uphill battle. We have paused the work that we're doing there. We know that that's a big opportunity for the city, and we haven't lost sight of it. But the study that we needed to fund was going to be about $250,000. that $250,000 does much more in the pockets of our small business community today and positions them for recovery, because we certainly can't lose. We don't have a traditional downtown. We have several business districts. If our business districts go down, then that certainly has an instant negative impact on our growing the population and our housing strategy. So those districts need to remain strong. And even though we would love to continue our path and stay on plan and stay on track with the large mall property, for the immediate impact, we needed to shift those dollars so that we can support our small business community for right now. So that's one example. There are lots of others.
Tanisha, that's great. Thank you. And I will say, my colleague Jonathan Tarr from Enterprise Community Partners just posted to the chat box links to some of the plans that you were discussing, Tanisha. So, so that's available for folks who want to see, kind of get down into the nitty gritty. Tanisha, this is great. And again, not the last time that we're going to ask you questions, but for now, we'll let you go back on mute and turn the mic over to Eric up in Sandusky.
Can everybody hear me now? First of all, I just want to say thank you, Allison, Lindsay, for setting this up. Greater Ohio has been a great partner, and what an honor it is for me to participate in this with Josh and Tanisha, two of the first city managers that I met when I took this position, which is my first city manager role in Ohio. And I look up to them a great deal in the communities that they serve, and certainly have borrowed, and I think you'll see some things echoing in my brief remarks that are happening in places like Hamilton and Cleveland Heights. Just to give a little on Sandusky for those who are less familiar, we're a city of 25,000 that is the largest city in a 4-county region of north central Ohio. That's about a little over 200,000 people. And we sit sort of 60 miles from Cleveland and 60 miles from Toledo, kind of right in the middle. So we're our own sort of small city, we're a small city that anchors a region that is best known to the outside world as a tourism destination due to the presence of Cedar Point in Sandusky. And then nearby Sandusky, you have a large collection of water parks that sit in Perkins Township just outside of the city limits, as well as the Lake Erie Islands, Put-in Bay and Kelly's Island, which downtown Sandusky is one of the 2 locations where you can get back and forth with ferry service, both to those islands, as well as being the only location where folks can get back and forth from Pelee Island, which is actually a Canadian island, and is the only actual international ferry service in the state of Ohio that connects between the mainland of Ohio and the Pelee Island, which is part of the province of Ontario. Historically, though, we had also been, in addition to being a town with a lot of tourism and hospitality, a community that had a great deal of manufacturing. And we still have a strong manufacturing base, but we lost a GM plant and a Ford plant that at their peak employed 7,000 full-time people in a county of about 70,000. So you can get a sense, and those were really good jobs that people had really relied on heavily here. And those started to phase out probably in the 90s and have been replaced to some extent by part suppliers with much less employment and certainly at a different wage level. And so we had to, when I was transitioning back, I grew up in Sandusky and was coming back after having spent some time in community and economic development in Cleveland for about a decade to come back to the city to have a chance to be a part of its sort of rebirth. But the recessions, and I heard a little bit from Josh and Tanisha about the recessions kind of layering onto each other. We had never quite rebounded from the 2008 recession here as I was getting started in 2014. Our total employment levels had dropped from about 300 to 200 in the city. And we were facing a deficit of nearly $2 million going into the 2015 budget that was going to have to force us to cut even more deeply. And so when I started, the city commission asked me to help sort of broker a transaction with Cedar Point, which is the largest employer in the area, and the other members of the business community, as well as residents. Residents had been really focused on raising the admissions tax on Cedar Point, which was at 3%, but we still sat at a 1% income tax. And Sandusky actually, as a municipality, gets a very low percentage of the property tax paid by properties in the area. I think we're at like 6 or 7%. And the schools get around 82%, and then various county agencies and our libraries take the rest. I've heard from some folks that that's the lowest percentage of property tax that they've seen. And obviously there are very few, built out legacy cities that had an income tax of 1%. And I think that's because on a per capita basis, we were able to provide, even with those low taxes at the city, relatively stable services because of the influx of revenue from Cedar Point, but it also created a culture of not feeling like we should ever raise taxes in the community because Cedar Point could always pay more, but they were frustrated that we weren't doing much to diversify our economy from them or our tax base from them. And so that led to a compromise that we called Issue 8 that was passed with 60% of the vote in 2014. And 3 previous attempts to raise the income tax actually failed with at least 60% of the population voting together. And I think the reason that we were able to turn those results around was because it was a true compromise between Cedar Point and the business community and the residents that wanted to see a doubling of the admissions tax. And I bring that up now because when we did that revenue enhancement then, it really started to create some momentum and deeper partnerships between Sandusky and our business community. Like Cleveland Heights, we didn't have a huge civic capacity here. We still have no community development corporation serving any area of Sandusky. And while we do have some local philanthropy, it's never been that internally focused back on the core of the city. I think we're getting to a much better place with them. But so we specifically dedicated resources from Issue 8. We dedicated half of the new admissions tax that were passed towards economic development. We also dedicated an increased amount in infrastructure, but we kept a certain pot of that infrastructure that was not just for basic maintenance, but what we called catalytic infrastructure. And then we also set aside a significant portion of the income tax increase for housing redevelopment and blight, because we have a very old housing stock in Sandusky. And we had a lot of demolition backlog that we needed, but most importantly, we also needed to stabilize the housing stock. In addition to those programs, which were funded by Issue 8, we've also set aside a 1% of our admissions tax collection each year for public art and placemaking. And then in addition to that, our bed tax, which has grown quite a bit in recent years, we set aside for marketing and programming of the city. And those projects or programs that were created over the last 5 years have helped us to create a lot of momentum in the city. We've had over $300 million invested in our community, including supporting the schools to build 3 new elementary schools, but also $100 million revitalization of our downtown, and then other waterfront development and new projects undertaken by Cedar Point that included the creation of the Cedar Point Sports Center, which is an indoor and outdoor sports recreation complex. And we really did want to make sure that we were diversifying away from tourism, in part because we knew our tax base was so reliant, and we wanted to both build on the tourism that we have here, but also to create opportunities to get away from it. And I think with COVID hitting, this past late winter, early spring, it really became glaring to us that why that transition was so important. And because we were, Cedar Point is now being able to reopen. That was uncertain until just a few weeks ago, but we know they're going to be very limited in their operations this year, and that our tax base is going to be in great peril both this year and next year. Our worst estimates of what was possible was that upwards of 40 to 45% of our revenue could go away. And that's again because we have a very low income and property tax comparatively to many other cities in our situation in Ohio. And admissions tax, if Cedar Point doesn't open, is basically completely wiped out, as well as that lodging tax, which we depend highly on. And then the income tax is actually paid by the 4,000 seasonal employees of Cedar Point not being present either. We're more hopeful now than we were just a short time ago because Cedar Point will be reopening, but we also want to make sure that reopening happens safely. And so just really briefly on some of the things that we undertook, and we were also very fortunate to be working with Greater Ohio and the National Resource Network and Enterprise. Shortly before COVID-19 hit, we were undertaking 2 projects with them that were funded by the Ohio Resource Network. One was a complete comprehensive financial analysis and plan for the city, which has come in really handy as COVID hit pretty early, and we've been able to sort of tailor that process to how we're going to respond not only this year, but over the next several years to the impact of COVID on our financial situation. And then in addition to that, we were working on a regional development plan that was focused on how to create a stronger civic capacity of getting our foundation community, our private sector, our larger institutions, not only in Sandusky and surrounding Erie County, but in all 4 of those surrounding counties, so that we could have an economic development strategy that embraced what worked for our local economy, but also started to see what we could be doing from a workforce perspective, from an infrastructure and placemaking perspective, and from targeting key industries that would allow us to continue to grow and to take advantage of the natural resources that are so plentiful up here. Those have been great. In addition to that, very similar, and we actually borrowed, I reached out to Josh. I saw something about his small business program, and we also talked to Lakewood, Ohio, which had a similar small business program. And we set aside a portion of our economic development funds from Issue 8 to do a very quick hitting small business grant program where, depending on their size,
small businesses and local businesses, and we had similar exclusions to what Josh talked about. Could apply for grants of either $3,000 or $1,500, depending on their size or the impact of COVID on their business model. We got those grants out the door within a few weeks. The process went really well, and I think it really helped us to build relationships with our local businesses at a time. You know, they knew that we were in need, but the fact that we still stepped up and funded that program, I think showed them that we know how important they are to our long-term success. In addition to that, we also have a really talented local videographer here that we've been working on and to kind of figure out how to tell Sandusky's story over the last several years, and that's New Departure Films. He really helped us, and at a deeply discounted rate, created a video series that we called Sandusky Stronger Together that really highlighted the ways in which people were coming together in the community during COVID-19, because we wanted to maintain that momentum. And that included first responders that work for the city, like our police and fire. It included our hospital system. It included small businesses and the steps that they were doing to overcome it, as well as some of those enduring assets of Sandusky that reminded people, you know, we just celebrated our bicentennial, and you know, we're a 201-year-old city. We have assets that have been here for 200 years or that will continue to be here, and that we're going to overcome this. And so, you know, we're really proud of that kind of held folks together. And interestingly, one of those assets, the State Theater, as Alice and I at least know, you know, suffered a devastating loss in a windstorm that came off of Sandusky Bay just last week. And we're still picking up the pieces of that. But I think it is that strength and resiliency that we demonstrated through COVID-19 that has allowed us to really, you know, there's no question to anyone that we're going to rebuild the State Theater. It's just a question of how much it's going to be and what the community's role in that will be versus the theater's role. But I really do feel like our goals have been, in spite of having a lot of challenges based on our revenue, is to take that momentum from issue 8. And I do want to mention, very similar to the Plan Hamilton document, coming out of the passage of issue 8, we did a year-long community process where we did what we call the Bicentennial Vision Plan in 2015, and we hit every neighborhood very similarly. We had over 2,000 of our 25,000 residents directly participate, either through surveys or community meetings in every neighborhood, or larger scale groups where we talked about things like the waterfront. And we put a plan in place for how we were going to deploy those resources. And as we now have put ourselves in a stronger fiscal position to weather the storm that we're facing, we're making sure that we have that plan to point back to. And we may have to make some difficult choices as to what gets prioritized, but we're not going to back away from that plan. So things like, we're just getting ready to reopen the Jackson Street Pier and Shoreline Drive, which was a complete makeover of the Sandusky waterfront. And one of the things that's had me most excited over the last several weeks is we are so identified by Cedar Point, but we haven't been able to welcome tourists to Cedar Point this year. But our downtown, since it's been opened in a socially distant and safe way, has been busier than ever. You know, people are coming down to check out the new pier. They're walking the new waterfront. In addition to that, we remain really focused on building the Sandusky Bay Pathway, which is a waterfront biking and multi-use path for pedestrians that will scale the entire city, and eventually want that to be a 70 or 80 mile trail system that spans the entire Lake Erie Shores and Islands region. We remain committed to the Bowling Green and Cedar Fair School of Resort Management that's under construction now on what was formerly an empty city parking lot, where they'll have a new higher education program offering bachelor's degree to folks that want to make a career in the tourism industry. You know, we are very much committed to doubling down, as well as others. And the programs, the biggest challenge that we've had to face, and I guess I'll just wrap it up with this and be happy to discuss further, is we've faced immense pressure to just get back to the basics. But what we've really done is reminded people that we did this plan for a reason. Many of those projects that we undertook were controversial, and it wasn't because we didn't handle them transparently, or it wasn't because we didn't make compromises, but it was because there were a lot of forces here who were either afraid of or opposed to the changes that we were making, but we thought they were critically important for our future. And so we took on, you know, what we thought was an appropriate amount of controversy, while still wanting to move the community forward, because the only thing worse than doing these projects in our mind would be not doing them. You know, in addition to that, there's great work that we've done in neighborhoods through community policing over the last several years, through tripling the size of our recreation department, that we think have helped us to navigate those things. But all that being said, we've really reminded our city commission, we reminded the public that yes, you know, some programs are going to have to be reduced in the short term. Certain projects are going to have to be prioritized, but we have fought hard to not just embrace going back to the basics, because really just focusing on the basics for a 30 or 40 year period where our economy was declining didn't suit us very well. And so while we're going to have to tighten our belts for a while, we need to maintain that focus and maintain that momentum and that change-oriented attitude so that we can continue to position Sandusky for the next 200 years.
Eric, that's great. Thank you. While we give people a chance to get their questions queued up, either for you or here in a minute, we're going to turn it over to just a broader discussion. Eric, you and I were recently talking, and you kind of following up on those last points you made of convincing folks or making sure that residents and community leaders understand that this momentum is here and that these priorities remain important. Can you talk a little bit about some of that budgetary stuff that you and I were recently talking about, how, you know, you may not be making the same kind of levels of commitments as you were at the beginning of the budget process, but you're also not completely wiping out that line item either?
Yep, absolutely. So we had, and I mentioned a lot of those programs in the upfront that were created either as part of Issue 8 or as part of the way that we implemented the Bicentennial Vision Plan that was sort of born out of Issue 8. But we reduced our public art program. We did not eliminate it. Very similar with our programming and our marketing fund and our economic development, some of which was moved from larger catalytic projects to supporting those small businesses, as others talked about doing as well. But we very much said, we're not getting out of any of these businesses. These are businesses that our city needs to be in right now. And again, I do think that depending on the scale or size of the civic infrastructure that exists outside of the municipality in certain places, there is a role for foundations to play or development corporations to play. We've really had to play a lot of that role in the city. And so if we get out of those businesses, in many cases, there wouldn't be anyone focused on that, not only maybe even in our city, but in our region. And so we basically said, okay, we're going to balance this budget. We're going to do it in a sound way, but we're not going to get out of these activities because we know we're going to need them again in the future. And my fear was, even if you say we're just going to stop doing all of these things for a 2-year period, who knows where the mindset is in 2 years. It might be much harder to recreate these short of another tax increase, which we're doing our best to make sure that we don't need, just because it's been so soon since we went to the voters since 2014. And so I think that that's really influenced not everyone. There's still some folks out there that think it is silly to spend money on some things we're spending on, even as we've had to cut in other areas. But again, I think there is a majority of Sanduskians and a vast majority of our city commissioners who understand our need to do these things to make sure our future is bright. And we can't make everybody happy, but we need to make sure that we sort of keep that, we're willing to spend the political capital that we do have to fight for the things that we think are going to be necessary, even if they're being done at a smaller level now. We're going to need them 3, 4, 5 years from now. We don't want to have to push that rock up the hill to create these, because it took us years in some cases to get these to pass, and we don't want to go through that process again.
Great. Eric, that's really helpful. Well, while we're waiting for folks at this point, we want to open up the floor. If there's questions, signal that in the chat box, or I think you might be able to raise your hand. We might be able to see that, but chat box, definitely know we can see you there. While we're waiting for folks to enter any questions or raise any, I guess my question for you all, Eric, Tanisha, Joshua, is that communities that may not have as fully formed or current plans as you all are working from, what advice can you give them today, right, to kind of help move forward in the coming weeks and months, absent of a really robust, well thought out plan that you all have as your backbones?
I would simply say, plan the work the plan, meaning you need to prioritize. I think Eric was saying that there's catalytic dollars out there that need to keep being pushed into the community, and just making sure that you're taking a hard look and that you've got your entire city team on board with this approach, and make sure that you're prioritizing where that money is going. It's almost like a small planning session, strategic planning session.
Yeah, I'd add to that, that, start with the data you have. So, if you're in a community like mine, data was hard to come by. Most of our data systems, were at least 30 years old, right? So putting information in was very challenging, but not more challenging than trying to get stuff out of those systems. So starting with the data you have to get a better understanding of where you're most vulnerable. So not looking at the easy, there are these things that are going to pop up. They feel like something you need to attack right away, or put human or financial resources to solve for. But you have to continue to pull back, even without a strategic plan or a master plan. Pull back to what are your key vulnerabilities for your community. Those are the areas that will make the most difference. And if you can't connect that use or expenditure of time and or money to this new future state that you're trying to get to, then it's not really worth it. Obviously, there are some absolute critical everyday things that we all have to do. But I think one of the things that COVID-19 taught us very quickly is there was a whole bunch of stuff we were all doing that we thought we absolutely had to do that has completely stopped for the last 3 months, and no one has said a thing about it. So it really is a great opportunity to kind of reprioritize how we're spending our money. And I've found even more opportunity to reallocate resources that, we thought this was a beloved program of the community or beloved service, or there's no way we cannot do X. Well, X became expendable when we redirected all of our energy toward, what we deemed to be essential everyday things. And so as you do that, it frees up money toward the things that aren't necessary every day, as Eric described, the basic things. And so those are your investment opportunities, and you have to find a way to continue to invest in those strategies that'll move you forward. And you know what those are, even without a robust planning effort. You know what those are if you just spend some time with your data that you have, your vulnerabilities, and you'll know where you need to redirect those resources.
And I would just add to that, and this is based just on what Tanisha said, I've heard throughout this, never waste a crisis. And I think, we're all in this situation where our normal way of doing things has been upset. And as Tanisha mentioned, in some ways that may mean there are things you can stop doing that you were spending time and resources on. And there are other times I think it's a good opportunity to bring the community together. And I've seen that both in the longer term with COVID-19, and then even in just the last week or two with the collapse of the Sandusky State Theater. There's already been really good conversations, and community folks are rallying around this idea of, okay, we're devastated by the loss of the theater, but we all know there are certain things that the theater hadn't updated over time, and what a great opportunity this is to maybe reimagine that the role that the theater can play, or what role a cultural arts center can play in our community. And so I think it is critically important, whether you're going to do a full-throated plan at this time or not, is to get the right stakeholders around the room and to ask the question of what we want to be. And I think ultimately when you start with that question of what do we want to be, you're going to see that there's more consensus in the room than otherwise. And it's only in the process of, okay, what are we going to have to invest in? What are we going to have to do? Or what are we going to have to change? Or what are the risks that we're going to have to take to get to where we've all agreed that we want to be, that you're going to start to see differences of opinion as to who should do what or how it happens and who has responsibility or power within that system. But if you have that galvanizing goal that you've already agreed on as to what you want to be as a community, you can remind people of that and maybe get to better results on resolving some of those entrenchments than you might otherwise if you didn't have that process where folks have already kind of stated intentionally what they hope for their community.
That's great. Thank you to all of you. So I was just scanning through the attendee list here. We have a lot of nonprofit folks, some philanthropy, maybe one or two private sector folks. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice for these folks who, are not sitting in the city manager seat, so don't have the same powers or limitations that you have? Are there things that you want to encourage nonprofit, philanthropy, business, particularly the folks here, that they can be doing at this time, particularly around long-term planning for communities?
I can start this one. I think it's critical. One of the things that I first heard when I got to Sandusky was, we've done so many plans. We don't want to do another plan. I want to fund a project, or I want to do this. And that was strange for me, because I had seen in at least the organizations I was involved with, Cleveland, were planning it effectively become progress or led to new programs or transactions. And what hit me was that they had always gotten to the planning part here, but then they had never actually taken that next step of what do we actually have to do to implement that plan. And so I really pushed hard on them to say, what you've done wrong is not the planning, but it's the absence of a commitment to following through on what the plan tells you, whether we love what that outcome is or not. And of course, you should plan practically. But so I would just say to them, to the folks in the nonprofit, or particularly on the funding side, there is almost nothing more powerful than bringing the different stakeholders of a community together around at the same time, of having a third party that isn't as invested in or doesn't have the history with the players that are around that table, to be able to speak candidly with all of them, and often confidentially with all of them, to really sort of bring that folks together and to get some buy-in around what they want to see. So I would absolutely both invest in that planning and pulling those groups together and getting those questions asked. But just as importantly, you should already, the foundation's role or the nonprofit's role, depending on whether they're a funder or whether they're a potential implementing partner, you should not only be focused on how you fund or implement the plan itself, but already be thinking about that second step of what resources, where are you going to find them that are going to help to implement that plan once it gets adopted. And I've heard you say this earlier, some of those are really short-term wins. You always need a short-term win coming out of a process like that. And other those are more structural, longer, hauls or changes, but really be thinking going into that process, not only provide that upfront funding to get the planning done, but how do you make sure that there's a plan for implementation so that you can really see over the next 3 to 5 years the results of that planning, which I think really builds up community confidence and funder confidence to do more or to think bigger.
Thanks, Eric. Tanisha, Joshua, any additional thoughts?
My only additional comment is, Tanisha, I need to get to Cleveland Heights. I am admittedly stuck in Southern Ohio most of the time, but I will say that my staff has, for the last year, has been trying to trade me for Eric in Sandusky. They keep calling to Sandusky to steal all his ideas, and literally 3 of my young staffers said to me about a month ago, they said, we really don't want you anymore. Would you think Eric would do a 1-for-1 trade? So Eric, just know that you are on my staff's short list. So they're trying to get rid of me.
And yours on ours, I have, we've actually, I don't know if I like the idea of taking ideas from us. We've actually taken ideas from you, and you've offered them up graciously and let us know. So I think it's just great that we're all getting together and sharing these ideas and going back and forth. And thank you, Allison, for bringing us together to do that, because I think we always come out of this better than when we try to deal with these things in isolation.
Yeah, agreed. Tanisha, do you want to put yourself up for a trade here?
For us as an inter-ring, our relationship as a city with funders is always a bit precarious, because our foundations obviously want to fund what they perceive to be the greatest need, which is typically in the central city, and it stops at those borders. What we have found, however, though, is as we try to empower our nonprofit community and get them to increase their capacity to do things that we need done, that they're interested in doing, they may not have had that expertise, but they have an interest, and they can have a better relationship and typically better outcomes with those foundations and funders than the city would have under any circumstance. So I think just in the last 2 or 3 years, the amount of dollars flowing from places like the Cleveland Foundation, which is the oldest and one of the most prosperous community foundations in the country, we've never received dollars like that in Cleveland Heights, but our CDC partners have been able to leverage that, because we can show them the plan, and this plan that we all work together on as a nonprofit community with the city, as residents with the city, as our small businesses with the city, and they can see where, we've already outlined where we thought partnership would make the most sense, and where their capacity is lacking. It's just so easy to make those ties now and help them tell a better story to funders so that they can do even more to increase their capacity, which we love, because then we can maybe start to reevaluate how much money we need to send to them that we might be able to reprioritize. So I would just say, we've got to be creative, and certainly now much more creativity. I'd love if we didn't have those challenges of the funding kind of stopping at the border, but I do think that being willing to seed our nonprofits and help them grow helps us in the long run as well. So.
Thank you, Tanisha. Well, I see we are at 1 o'clock, and so we will be respectful of everyone's time. But again, this is not the end of the conversation by far. These are the contact information emails for Eric, Tanisha, and Joshua. We're just offering it up actually without permission. I hope you guys don't mind if folks have questions, want to follow up. I want to say again, thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts today. Really appreciate that. For everyone who's on the line, we do invite you to come to our third webinar that is scheduled for June 30th at 2 p.m. At that webinar, Greater Ohio and Enterprise Community Partners will be talking about state and federal funding that we expect will be coming down the pike or is currently available, both to help in the immediate sort of COVID response, but also in the longer term in terms of community, revitalization and ongoing building. So with that, appreciate your time. Again, and thank you to Arnold Ventures and Just Transition Fund for their support for this webinar and the great work happening across the state. And with that, we'll wish everyone a great afternoon. Thank you so much.